Welcome to TR Unblocked, Coral. Now, the Ready House positions itself as a strategic creative partner to help brands and retailers alike to become future ready. Just tell us how it works.
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Peter, for inviting me onto the blog. The Ready House ultimately started off as a social media business. And what we quickly realised over the course of a few years is ultimately what we have to become is a branding business. And that's because it doesn't really matter what the medium is, right? And social media businesses often think in medium first. But it's always got to be about brand. And so over the course of the last 5 years, we've pivoted the business across how we think in a brand first manner, however, have social and content as our main output. And like a traditional branding agency, it is about thinking about your values and your purpose. But ultimately what we've got to do is be seeing it through the lens of our consumers. And social media is the best way to do that.
So who's doing it right at the moment?
God, where do I start? I think Glossier, obviously a global kind of beauty cosmetics brand, do it incredibly well. They have over 2 million followers. However, you can kind of picture it and with how they set up their business. You know, you've got a C-suite executive kind of table, and ultimately one of the people sitting around that table was their social media presence. They are a truly social first brand, and that's because they put their consumers at the heart of every decision that they make, from packaging decisions through to the next products they're bringing out. And the audience truly do have a say. Now, granted, they have over 2 million followers, so they're going to be a very engaged community. However, what I'd like to challenge, and I guess this is my call out to a lot of brands and other businesses that might not have as many followers, how can we start challenging that mindset with 10,000 followers? With 5, maybe with 1,000 followers, to start understanding that our consumers or our audience members, they're not stupid anymore, and they don't want to just be consistently sold product. They want to be brought into the decision making of brands and understand how they forge the future of these businesses and what they're doing. And brands no longer can kind of be so on the fence and just pushing product. They need to kind of pick a side and understand. And I don't, when I say political, I don't mean party political, but they need to be more equipped to understanding what their view of the world is, and they need to have an opinion about it because consumers are going to either follow them or not.
But you're asking for a complete change in mindset from some of these brands, aren't you?
Absolutely. It's because social media and digital presence is seen at the moment as an add-on. And I think ultimately, whether it's a physical experience through an airport, whether it's a physical experience through your shop, we've got to be thinking about the interplay between digital and physical. And you know, there's obviously a phrase around online and offline and phygital spaces, but ultimately it's not about any of these. It's about inline and how we blur those two digital worlds. So yeah, it is a fundamental shift from brands, of course. However, there is power within audience, and ultimately what we talk about as a business is how we unlock the potential of your community through brand-focused thinking.
So moving on, let's look at 2 other examples you can provide.
Sure. So there's a really fantastic global brand called AI. Now, they're a headphone business, and obviously they are in a very, very congested market. They are operating in a market with Beats, with Bauer & Wilkins, with Bose. And what they've realised is that they ultimately have a product that can stand toe-to-toe, but they've realised through their positioning, through the way that they sell their product, it's about how they contribute to the culture of their consumers. And they are completely genre agnostic. You know, they can be talking about hip hop one time and they can be talking about punk the other time. And what they've realised is how do they start lifting their community and put their community at the heart of their brand story, rather than consistently using their physical retail, their online content and their online shop as opportunities just to sell product. Now, for context, they sell a completely modular headphone. So you could buy earbuds one month with a certain headband, and then as your musical journey kind of advances, you can upgrade your product. And it's amazing what they do. It's almost like a triangle pyramid, right? So they have at the top, they have artists that they give their headphones to and they sponsor their shows. And these are really respected musicians. In the middle ground, they have community heroes. So people who have online presence, they really kind of lift their voice and their topics around music. And at the bottom, they have the consumers that are working upwards and looking up into what these kind of the higher echelons are doing. However, they are not afraid of putting their community in the heart of their story. And it doesn't really matter if it's a respected musician or a community member and a kind of a consumer like you and me. It's about how they give almost a voice. They give them the mic to tell their own story through their brand channels. Ultimately, the holy grail of all marketing is going to be word of mouth. And the beauty about word of mouth is that it's entrenched within story. And I think what brands are doing at the moment is that they're consistently using their social media profiles and their content just to sell product. They're not interweaving story and creating what we call social moments.
But in fairness, some brands are actually weaving some narrative into their story.
Absolutely.
Around the product. Largely the same. They just ape each other.
It is, and what they do is that they ultimately open their doors to a certain extent around their process or around how the product comes to life. However, what is that next level of how brands start contributing to the culture? Long gone are the days now brands just consistently benefiting from the consumer engaging with their product and buying their stuff. What we need to be thinking is how brands start contributing to the culture and start giving back to their audiences. Audiences are going to become incredibly picky or choosy around the brands that they start engaging with. They're going to have what we're calling a brand circle. You know, from where they get their groceries from all the way through to where they understand their trusted products.
But yes, trusted means they're judging them on the basis of some of their sustainable actions as well, aren't they?
Sustainability is huge. And I think brands are increasingly having that on their periphery of thought and often is being used as a way in terms of storytelling. However, transparency is no longer good enough. Just opening up your doors to what and how your product is made, or how your business has come to life from a sustainable angle, is no longer good enough. The great example is a business called Sheep Inc. Now, they are 3 years old. They are a completely D2C business, and they are the world's first carbon negative fashion brand. Ultimately, what they've done over the last 3 years is that they've put the consumer at the heart of their brand story. Now, what they sell is a merino wool sweater, and they are completely carbon negative from a natural standpoint, so they don't offset anything. So what they do with every single sweater sold, the purchaser becomes an adoptee of a sheep. And on every single sweater there's an NFC tag, and you can tap your phone on that tag and you can understand the whole provenance journey of how your sweater was made from a raw material into it being delivered to your door, the carbon journey, but most importantly, because you're an adoptee, you can also name your sheep. You can also receive updates from the farm, updates of the sheep. So what they've done is realise and move the dial from just transparency to understanding how the consumer plays a part in the transparency story. You naturally have an emotional connection to checking your sheep and checking the journey around your product. And within that, there is obviously storytelling, but they're almost creating other counter narratives as well, and other beautiful kind of pieces of content of where it's about when your sheep had a lamb. And that's where I think brands need to be going, is around how we become more emotive with our brand storytelling.
Okay, let's just develop this a little bit. Let's say I'm a middle-ranking spirits brand and a high-flying fragrance brand. What would your advice to those two businesses be?
I think fragrance brands and drinks brands have quite a lot of work to do. If you look at the current setup in terms of how they try and sell product and the data that they have on their consumers and the way that they position their products, I don't think is smart enough. Now, ultimately, we have one of our clients is Mount Gay Rum, and they are one of the oldest rum brands in the world. But the journey that they are on is incredible, because what they are doing is they're understanding for each product that they sell, call it 3 or 4 core products, that there's a different consumer type for each. Now, that's pretty standard across drinks brands and fragrance brands. However, the way that they are activating those consumers is really quite interesting. Whether it is understanding the cultural fabric of what these consumers are truly interested in beyond rum. What we've done with them is that we've actually created a whole kind of way of thinking and I guess a cultural breakdown of each of their audience types. Now, this is about details from the things that they're reading, to their purchasing power, through to other interests that they might have, all associated with rum. And what we've realised, take the XO for example of Mount Gay Rum, is that those drinkers who are drinking the XO are also interested in literature, are also interested in sustainability, are also interested in classic cars. So suddenly, even just understanding those 3 things, we've understood that it's not just about selling product, it's about maybe how we're collaborating with brands that are operating in these different spaces. It's about maybe how we're putting ads and thinking and thought pieces in magazines that focus around literature or around classic cars. It's understanding where consumers are also interested in to then realise where content can go and storytelling can go. Now, from a point of view of physical experience, I think there's a lot of work to do. And digital there's fewer barriers to entry, because as long as you've got some great content and a great strategy, you can action that pretty quickly. From a physical retail point of view, I still ultimately think that we are operating on quite a traditional model. And it's a lot about footfall. It's a lot about, obviously, number of units sold. And I think we need to be shifting those value metrics to actually how can we start valuing a brand based on the impressions that they gain on social media through these physical spaces. We were just talking earlier around how we start using these physical spaces almost not as just pick up and buy, but also broadcasting hubs. Yes. And putting the community, whether it's influencers, whether it's an audience member or a kind of a fan or a hero of the brand, in the heart of the physical experience to start translating the brand story and the reason that they love the product to their own community in these physical hubs.
Well, the influencers themselves are the brands, but they get the income as a result. The point is, in travel retail, it may not quite work that way, and the retailer want to be entering the playing field.
Yeah.
But that it could be doable in travel retail.
It could do, and I think ultimately, like I said, the revenue model is, especially for airports and retail, is always going to be about footfall and driving of sales. But I want to start challenging that mindset. I still think obviously it's a very important part of the mix. These products, these brands have to be commercially viable, have to be commercially successful. However, why are we not valuing what that value really truly is when it comes to an impression? And I mean online impression, when it comes to a follow, when it comes to a like. If a consumer follows your brand online, they are openly inviting you to talk and be editorial within their personal feed. And I think there is an inherent value. Whether they're a purchaser yet or not, you've got a longer time to kind of nurture them and understand how you engross them within the story of the brand. And I don't think we have really a metric system around how we value this non-monetary return on investment, and that's something that we try and educate brands on.
Are you developing a system to work?
We are.
To work it out?
We are indeed. Like I said, and started this interview, we're a branding business and ultimately at the heart a creative agency. And I think creative agencies have struggled for a long, long time to understand the value metric that they bring to brands in terms of brand building. And so what we're doing in the longer term is that we're hopefully building a ready score that hits a hero of different points and values them. And one of them may be revenue as well, ultimately, but it's also around impressions, it's also around press mentions, it's also around the influencers that you engage with. To understand how are we creating a score that values all of these different data points to then understand where brands are in a mix of non-monetary and monetary return on investment. So yeah, longer term thinking, but yeah, for sure.
Interesting fusion.
Yes.
But whether or not you can actually get it to work is open to question.
An agency like us have to take that step to creating what a first version looks like. And it is the biggest myth in our sector. And I think obviously with a lot of brands thinking why they're engaging with these creative agencies, because the value metric at the moment is always about monetary return on investment. And I think that has to shift.
You talked about spirits, but what about fragrance and cosmetics?
Fragrance and cosmetics. I think cosmetics have actually come quite far. And I think there's some really good examples of brands, let's say MAC, for example, who have a brilliant knack of understanding that they have to interweave a pick-up and purchase experience with an experiential, more customised kind of experience as well. And the way they're translating that between physical and digital is quite interesting. They put sometimes their influencers, beauty influencers, at the heart of their stores. Their customers are serendipitously having experiences of where they're getting their full makeup done, but they're also allowing people to just come and buy a product because they know exactly what they want. So I think there are some really good examples within beauty, and I think there's a lot of beauty brands as well that need to be looking at players like that to understand what that looks like. Within fragrance, it's not so good. And we're actually doing quite a lot of work with some fragrance brands at the moment. And obviously, as you can imagine, especially in the world that we operate in, to try and translate fragrance digitally is very difficult. But that's why there's got to be such a reliance on the people that you collaborate with and the people that are speaking on behalf of your brand. There's lots of businesses out there that are, from a fragrance perspective, that are doing it in quite a stereotypical, boring way. Uploading product pack shots, uploading what their bottles look like, and not actually going into the depths of how the product was created. The thinking process, to the certain notes, but also most importantly, understanding how does a influencer or at least a brand start becoming more editorial in the way that they talk about these products. And from a physical experience point of view, it is literally a stack them high and just show them to kind of understand, it's all based off of the smell. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done with that.
So let's move on. Amongst the travel retail sector, which operator do you think is doing some interesting things?
Interesting question. I think on the whole, the experiences physically and digitally are rather bland. However, there are efforts, I think, and very kind of pinpointed efforts around seeing this shift to localization. I think WH Smith's and Gatwick, for example, are doing something really quite interesting. However, it's very stereotypically London. And like I was kind of alluding to earlier, I know we'll probably come onto this a bit later, but it's around understanding the cultural fabric of what audiences are truly interested in. And just localizing a store with big London brands or UK brands like Hamleys, for example, I don't think is smart enough. And what they are doing as a concept is great. The execution, not so much. How are we heroing local entrepreneurs, local artisans, something that is ultimately very unique when you're going into that experience that you cannot get out anywhere else? And for granted, you won't be able to necessarily get Hamleys in Schiphol Airport, However, it's something that is very stereotypical when it comes to what a UK experience is. And I think it just that dial needs to be shifted a little bit to understanding a more localised story.
But this is a learning curve for them.
A learning curve, and that's why I think it is a positive step in the right direction. And let alone what that then entails for a digital storytelling experience. We're obviously still thinking, like we've alluded to earlier, still thinking about transaction. And why are we not thinking about interaction with our audiences and understanding how that becomes a point that I need to visit that place when I've got my flight from that airport. And I think airports are in a difficult position because ultimately the experience and the choice from the consumer largely dictated by the price of the flight and the destination that they're going to. But I think there's a real opportunity to understand how we start treating airports as brands and how that airport brand has an opinion around the type of experience it has, around the type of retail mix it has, around the type of stories it tells on its social media platforms. And I think that's the shift that needs to be made. Yes, it's always going to be dictated by the flight and the destination, but let's make that experience fantastic, because we know that when the consumer is taking a flight from there, they know they're going to have a great experience.
Yeah, but in real terms, how many airports can you actually classify as actually being brands? Less than a handful globally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Changi Airport in Singapore is doing something quite interesting. They're understanding that communities are looking for greater, resonance and connection with the brands, with brands in general, but ultimately airport brands. Now, exploring what Web3 looks like and the differences between Web2 and Web3, there's quite a few. But ultimately, it's brands that are going to start building the bridges between Web2 and Web3 for consumers to start walking over. And Web2 is great in terms of your traditional Instagrams, Twitters, and your Facebooks of this world. But it allows for a brand at the top to start thinking about how it translates to its consumers. And it's a very top-down approach. And yes, there's interaction, people can comment, people can engage with the content. However, what Web3 does is it puts the brand on an equilibrium with the consumer. And I think that's the shift that they've quite cleverly started to make. Now,
do you think the brand should be harnessing the metaverse better in Web3?
Absolutely. And especially if we start gamifying what that experience looks like. If we can start understanding how people can almost start earning rewards as they're interacting with content, as the brand is listening more to what the consumers are saying to each other that they're actually, the more interaction, the more benefits and rewards that you have in the physical world. I think that's where the opportunity lies. There's some really interesting businesses, and specifically one that we're working on at the moment, of how we start interweaving Web3 within a physical experience. And that's by buying tokens, that's by about getting access to certain information that you wouldn't otherwise have. And this starts proliferating the type of content that a brand starts sharing. What's my physical content? What's my digital content on Web 2? And what's my Web 3 content? Because ultimately, they all play a part in understanding what the brand story is. So I think Changi Airport is doing something quite interesting there. But like I said, it's very limited. And there's massive opportunity for...
There are precious few other brands actually doing anything meaningful in this area. They're just putting their toe in the water. But the brands are leading. The airports are way behind.
I think one of the best examples for me is on Decentraland and what Domino's have been doing. You know, Domino's ultimately are creating Web3 spaces of where a consumer or a digital audience member, so your online profile, can walk into a Domino's store in the metaverse and ultimately order a pizza that then gets delivered physically. That is fascinating to me. So what does the role of that decentralized store then become? Ultimately, it's a website that your online profile can start exploring and walking into. For example, point in case with an airport, how can we start treating an airport almost sometimes like a click and collect? If you've got an online profile, a Web3 profile, where your online persona is kind of navigating, then understanding that I'm taking a flight, then using it as an opportunity to then engage physically with that consumer. We've got to be thinking about how we're building out these worlds, not only about our physical experience, but how we're adding these layers, because consumers are becoming increasingly more complex. And we as brands need to adapt, especially airport brands.